Now let's say in your office you decided to configure this Palo Alto Firewall as a web proxy. Now you also came to know that in order to use this web proxy, you need to have the URL category, and in order to have URL category, you must be having the licenses for the URL category to function properly. Then you might be having the Palo Alto sales manager going to say you that you can buy the advanced URL filtering license. But you might be having some basic question like every engineer has, which is what is URL filtering, right? If you are like stepping into first time into Palo Alto Firewall and try to configure this web proxy, I'm talking as a beginner level, so it is likely to have this kind of question like what is URL filtering specifically when it comes to Palo Alto Firewall. So let's try to find the answer for this question. So as per Palo Alto Firewall, what they say is the companies have used URL filtering as a tool to prevent employees from accessing unproductive websites. So this is the main motive of any companies when they are implementing the URL filtering. So if we try to understand from this particular diagram, let's say we are not using Palo Alto web proxy, but we do have our own third-party web proxy server. So this particular web proxy, basically what it is doing, it is stopping employees to visit any kind of unproductive websites, right? So that is the main function of any web proxy. If you have like any third-party web proxy, it will stop your user visiting any sites which you have blocked. For example, it can be facebook.com. if you would like to stop any kind of social networking website, it can be streaming website, for example youtube.com, something like that. So you want your user to be productive when they are in the office, right? You do not want them to use any kind of unproductive website. So that is the main motive of this web proxy, to stop user visiting any kind of unproductive website, right? But as for the Palo Alto, they are going like further than this. So what they're saying basically, with today's URL filtering, the firms enable secure web access protection from increasingly sophisticated threats, including malware and phishing sites. So basically what they're trying to do is, with their URL filtering, not only you're going to stop any unproductive website, but also you can take an advantage of stopping any kind of sophisticated threats, any kind of malware or phishing site. So what happens basically, after you enable this advanced URL filtering, you are going to take an advantage of like stopping any kind of unproductive website, right? Because it is already been enabled into the a URL category, like we can see in the lab. But at the same time, what it does basically, it does like kind of live detection. So as we saw in our earlier topic, that if user will try to visit any kind of website and it has kind of any malicious content like coming through this URL, the Palo Alto Firewall will inspect that traffic, whether it is HTTP or HTTPS, and if there is kind of malicious content inside that particular URL, then it will stop that right away. At the same time, we also saw that Palo Alto has its own cloud, right? For example, it has a Palo Alto database cloud, and when you have advanced URL filtering, it downloads that actually database onto your firewall, and any kind of attack is going on these maybe internet, they update their database and downloads on your firewall, and the firewall is able to stop that kind of activity right away. So that is the good advantage of using Palo Alto advanced URL filtering. So that is their definition is basically, you can stop any user visiting the unproductive website just like web proxy, but at the same time what you can do is you can stop any kind of threats, any kind of malware or any kind of phishing site, right? Now the next question might gonna come in your mind, which is, why do we need even Palo Alto URL filtering? For example, you might say that, let's say I have this web proxy which is offered by any third party, and I'm happy with like what it does, like stopping any kind of unproductive website. So the question would be like, why even I need Palo Alto URL filtering? I understand that it going to stop any kind of live detection, something like that. But is it necessary to have this Palo Alto advanced URL filtering, right? So let's try to understand answer to this question. Now in this particular section, let's assume this is not DNS server, but this is your web proxy, right? And what you have done, basically you are going to stop any kind of category by based upon the policies being set on this web proxy, right? So it is going to do its job, that is going to stop any kind of unproductive website from accessing. Now in this situation, let's understand you trying to block the facebook.com user visiting. So if user will try to visit any website, it will come to proxy. From proxy it will try to go to Facebook, but you have blocked this facebook.com user visiting. So it is going to do its job, it's going to block facebook.com on its web proxy. But now situations are keep changing as the companies are keep increasing. Now for example, the companies like facebook.com or maybe Google, they are keep increasing their data center not only into same region but different region. For example, if the facebook.com has the website in US, but now what they are doing, basically they are actually spreading into different part of the world. Same like Google, same like Amazon, like they are actually setting up their data center in multiple region. So my point basically here is such big companies, they are now setting up their data center in different part of the region to give better user experience. Now if you take an example from the Google or maybe Amazon, right? Now they have the cloud computing. For example, Microsoft Azure, they also have their cloud computing, which is like they have their data center in all different part of the region. Now by having such cloud computing, you can take an advantage and you can set up your data center in any part of the region. But there comes challenges as well. For example, there is one attacker or multiple attacker are sitting any part of the region. Now they also can set up their malicious domain by using this cloud computing, right? For example, the user might be sitting in maybe Australia and he's trying to set up their one of the malicious domain in India. So they can just bring any kind of this server or maybe Linux, something kind of malicious attacking server they can bring up in any part of the region, right? So this is all possible because of the cloud computing. So the challenge comes like, how are you going to understand whether this particular server is malicious or not, right? So such issues basically solved by the advanced URL filtering, because once you enable this advanced URL filtering, it is going to understand by help of the, as we discussed about the Palo Alto database. So with the help of database, they have such kind of entries. If any domain is going to register newly and they try to claim that they are the legit, or any domain which is registered just now and that look like kind of malicious or performing any kind of malicious activity, then such database entry is going to download on your particular firewall and it's going to understand, okay, this is kind of malicious activity performing by this domain, and this is basically going to stop by this URL filtering capability. Now the next challenge comes, which is, for example, if you have the domain which sound like legit, right? But the next challenge comes, how are you going to stop any content which is inside that particular domain coming from? So if you have like a specific web filtering web proxy, it takes time to understand, okay, this particular URL might be having some kind of malicious content because it has to update its own database. But with the help of Palo Alto URL filtering, it is fetching up all this detail from the live detection is going on. For example, let's say the Palo Alto also have their own cloud computing, and as we discussed, this is their own database. So any activity is going throughout the internet, what they do basically, they keep updating their database from all activities going from any part of the world. And since they have this large database, they can detect any kind of malicious activity very easily, and they can push the update, or the firewall can pull the update from this database. So this become very easier to block any kind of malicious content is going inside the URL by using this Palo Alto advanced URL filtering. Now let's say we have got better understanding about Palo Alto web proxy and the advantage of using Palo Alto URL filtering, right? But before we go configuring this URL filtering, there are some basics we need to understand, because these are the steps which is going to be very helpful while you configure the URL filtering, right? So let's try to understand what are those basics. Now you might already know about what URL is, right? But when you are going to configure URL into Palo Alto Firewall, they have their own kind of steps or requirements in order to configure this URL. So it is necessary to understand some basics about the URL. So the first question is, which is, what is URL, right? So the definition is basically very simple. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. A URL is nothing more than the address of a given unique resource on the web, right? So in simple understanding, URL is nothing but the path. For example, if you have a web server, and in the web server you have database, and database you have created one of the file which is like web.html, right? And this file has to be accessed by the user. If there is a user who would like to access this web server, is going to go onto internet, from internet is going to hit to web server, and the path to this particular file is actually called Uniform Resource Locator, or URL. So this is very simple a definition of the URL. Now let's try to understand this in a next level. So the URL basically going to divide it into multiple categories or multiple sections. So first section is basically this protocol. So you can access URL based upon the protocol, which is popular protocol, which are like HTTP and HTTPS. But if you are trying to access any kind of file, it can be FTP as well. But the HTTP and HTTPS, they are the two protocols you will be using in the URL. You should not be using the HTTP if there is HTTP, which means it is clear text. That means there can be some malicious domain who are hosting their website on HTTP, but it does not mean that malicious domain would not host their website on HTTPS, right? So you need to understand that it can be both HTTP or HTTPS if they are like malicious domain, right? But as per the understanding, the first section which include in the URL, which is protocol, and that can be HTTP or HTTPS. The next come, which is this domain. It can be Google, it can be Facebook, it can be Amazon. So this is nothing but just the domain. The next is followed by the TLD. So TLD stands for top level domain. So what happens when you have any domain and you try to register that domain into the TLD, you have to give some TLD name. Basically, top level domain can be in different categories. For example, it can be in .com, it can be .in, it can be .net, .go, or it totally depends upon in which domain category you are registering your domain with, right? So that is the top level domain. Now let's move on to the different section of this URL. So different section is basically custom URL. This is important because what happens, sometimes we get a request that we would like to allow particular URL which has this custom port. So what happens, sometimes engineer allow this URL just like https.website.com, but the issue comes where they do not allow this custom port. So what's gonna happen, this URL is basically going to work upon port 443, which is like a typical default port for this HTTPS, right? So when you are trying to access this URL, it's not gonna work, because you might think, okay, it should be working, but Palo Alto Firewall, what it's gonna do, it's going to use this URL based upon the default port 443. So it's going to block this traffic. So when you try to allow some specific website and it includes some custom port, you need to include this URL with the custom port as well, otherwise that URL is not going to work. Now let's move on to the next section, which is URL can also have the subdomain. For example, you are trying to visit google.com, but google.com also has docs.google.com, right? So that can be like subdomain. If you have such website, it can include the custom port, but if it is not, it's going to be just default port. And then the last part come, which is the resource path. Resource path is nothing but the file name you are accessing. So if you are trying to allow or block particular URL which has all these detail, then and what level you'd like to allow or block, it's totally up to you. For example, you want to be more specific that you want to allow or block any URL until this, so you have to mention all the detail until this, otherwise it's not gonna work. But if you want to be more specific, you can define the detail until this. So what happens when user try to visit any particular URL, they would be more specific, right? For example, if you try to allow URL based upon this until .com, then anything is hosted behind this .com is going to be allowed. For example, it can be ABC, it can be XYZ, anything is behind that .com is going to be allowed. So when you would like to be more specific, you need to understand such terminology. That is something we're going to discuss in coming section. So let's try to understand how this URL works when we try to allow or block by using those specific methods. So this document basically provided by Palo Alto Network, and what they're trying to say is if you try to configure any URL filtering or URL match into Palo Alto Firewall, then how it's gonna function basically. So let's say if you try to configure any URL, for example paloaltonetworks.com, then how the matching criteria is going to work. So the matching criteria is going to work like, first is going to match paloaltonetwork.com, but not only that, it can also going to match .au, .random.org or anything like that. And it is happening because what they are trying to say is an implicit asterisk is assumed at the end of the domain. For example, end of the domain, they believe that there is asterisk is present, and the meaning of asterisk is like it can be any, right? And it is happening because a trailing slash is not present. So if you want to make it limited, then you need to provide a trailing slash, otherwise it will believe the asterisk is available after the domain and it is going to match any. Now let's move on to the next part. Now the next example is paloaltonetwork.com/example. Now this is going to match exactly because you are providing the trailing slash as well as the URL, you are providing this subdirectory as an example, right? Now the next one is when you try to configure URL by using this asterisk sign. So this is the most likely you will be configuring your URL, because you're not going to match each and every URL on the website. If you have one of the website, for example microsoft.com, it has like many subdomain or register right in the cloud. So if you want to just allow microsoft.com along with the subdomain, this is the good method to allow such domain. Otherwise you are not going to find there all thousands or maybe more URL available in the cloud domain. So this is the good way to allow such website. So what happens if you are using the asterisk like this? What it's going to do basically, it's going to believe that example.com is there, but before that there is asterisk, which means I'm going to match www, I'm going to match docs, or I'm going to match anything like support.tools example. For example, if Microsoft has like support.tools.microsoft.com, that is going to match by using such asterisk. Now the next is like if you have your own domain, for example med.example.com is given here, but you believe it's going to become like a more top level domain in the future, then you can define the asterisk. So what it's going to do basically is going to allow .com, .co.uk, and anything like after this particular domain is going to allow top level domain if you want to do something like this. Now the next one is if you have asterisks between your domain and top level domain. So what is gonna be your matching criteria? It's gonna match your website between this domain and TLD. It can be like example.yoursite, or it can be two dot is gonna come, for example es.domain, right? Because this asterisk is going to sit between your example and .com, so it can be anything in between this example and .com, because the asterisk says like it can be anything between this example and .com. So the next example we see like even it can be a.b, something like that, but after .com it can be info.us, because it believes that there is like asterisk is available after this particular domain. So that is how like this domain criteria is working. Now let's move on to the next example. This next example says about like having some kind of subdirectories. So if you want to give access based upon the subdirectory, after this slash is going to be asterisk, which means it's going to be subdirectory. It can be subdirectory of photos, it can be like blog or latest, anything you can define. It's going to believe that after slash it is present as a subdirectory. The next one is carets. Caret is a very good method of allowing or blocking any kind of URL based upon the domain or subdomain. So in this example it shows as a google.com followed by the caret. So I do not think it may be a good idea, because it might gonna work same as a asterisk, because it believes that anything after this .com is going to be allowed, right? But it can be useful into the upcoming examples. Let me show you what. So in this section what it's trying to do is it is using the carets before the domain. So what it is trying to say that it has to be just one subdomain. So it can be like subdomain can be like www, it can be like news, it can be docs, right? So it doesn't want anything come before or after that. For example, if you are using news.abc.google.com, it is not going to work, because it believes that it wants only subdomain with one caret allowed. So it has to be either news or it has to be .abc only. It is not going to work with the two carets, because it believes that two carets, but what I'm doing basically I'm allowing just one caret, right? So let's move on to next example so you would understand. So here like we have two carets of subdomain. For example, it says like you can allow only two subdomain. So it can be www.maps.com, so it's going to be one caret, then the second caret. Same like support.tools.google.com, so the first caret and second caret. So you cannot have like third caret in here, right? Like it can be www something like that, or it cannot be just one caret only, because when you are defining some matching criteria, your URL should be matching as per that. Same like www.tools.google.com. So that is how you can use carets to match specific URL. Now the final example is like the caret can also be between the like domain and TLD. So it can be domain your Google and the TLD is .com. So it believes that caret is between them. So it can be anything, but it has to be just one. You cannot say example.abc.com, because you are giving the exact match based upon the caret. So that is how it's going to work like other example like google.company.com. So this is how you can use both asterisk and the caret just to allow or block URL in URL filtering or URL lists. So these were some basics about URL and URL filtering, because when you are going to work with URL filtering, you should be having such information that if you are going to block or allow specific URL, how you are going to block or allow. Because sometimes what we do basically we just block or allow URL by giving the domain name or TLD, but sometimes it doesn't work. It happens because we block in a wrong way, and this information is very useful to understand when we are allowing or blocking specific URL. Then how are we allowing? Are we allowing based upon specific match, or are we allowing based upon the asterisks or carets? So we can take an advantage of, for example, if you are in banking sector, you want to give specific match, or you like to block depend upon the asterisks or carets. that is the method is really going to be useful if you are doing search like blocking or allowing based upon such URL filtering, right? Now in the next section, what we're going to do, basically we're going to create a lab and we will start our lab with the URL custom list. So this is for now, and I'll see you in the next section.